concentration camps. And he gave the analysis that basically, as capitalism emerged, the Jewish people were left with two choices. One was to assimilate, and many did, because capitalism offered the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, was like equality under law, and Jewish people have done very well with it under the rule of law, right? When you have equal rights regardless of ethnicity, when you have a civic notion of citizenship as opposed to an ethnic notion, they've actually done really well. And that's one reason actually why I'll come to later, is that a lot of Jewish people contemporarily are getting very alienated with Israel, because Israel is now portraying itself as a lawless state, and Jewish people have always been done very well by societies that abide by the law, and it's becoming very difficult for Jewish Americans, Jewish Canadians, people in Britain who are Jewish, to reconcile the two. But I've got a couple of interesting quotes here that. So the thesis of Abraham Leon was that basically capitalism developed very quickly in places like Britain and Germany. So a lot of Jewish people assimilated into German society. It wasn't free of anti-Semitism. You couldn't work in the public service, for example. But in Russia, it didn't emerge as quickly. And so what happened was we had this split in the Jewish world, where the Jewish community that was so homogenous under feudalism, and it was really, had a Jewish identity, stayed that way in the Eastern Europe and in Russia. Whereas in places like Germany, France, Britain, Jewish people had kind of lost their Jewish identity, because they became, I'm German, or I'm French, or I'm British, right? And so there became this fracture in the Jewish world, which is a really important distinction to understand how Zionism emerged, and I think that's really important. So Leon says, in effect, the evolution of the Jewish question resulting from the capitalist development has been thrust onto diametrically opposite paths. On the one hand, capitalism favoured the economic assimilation of Judaism, and consequently its cultural assimilation. On the other hand, by uprooting the Jewish masses, concentrating them into cities, provoking the rise of anti-Semitism, it stimulated the development of Jewish nationalism. And so, and then I quite like the way he describes it here. He says, the highly tragic situation of Judaism in our epoch is explained by the extreme precariousness of its social economic position. So it's an economic role that went on, and that's how I believe it's the best way to understand this, was that, and understand why the Holocaust occurred, and how it was that Zionism, the Zionist minority of Jews, which I'll come to later, managed to colonize Palestine. And it says that the first to be eliminated by decaying feudalism, the Jews were also the first to be rejected by the convulsions of dying capitalism. So there was this, he was a Trotskyist, Abraham Leon. It was like, a lot of these people believed it was inevitable. Capitalism wasn't maybe going to destroy itself. Like Hitler was the representation of the last death throes of capitalism. It was going to end. And of course, he was in Belgium and travelled around, but most people in Germany, which was the most industrialised country, thought that's where the communist revolution would come. That's why Hitler had to use all this rhetoric of socialism, national socialism, because he tried to galvanise the class-conscious working people. And so so dying capital, the Jewish masses find themselves wedged between the anvil of decaying feudalism and the hammer of rotting capitalism. And so, and as I say, so it's very sad that Abraham Leon ended up getting gassed, because right in 1945, I believe, as well. So he didn't want to stay in Belgium, and he travelled around Europe, because helping to publish illegal Trotskyist newspapers, because he believes, and Trotsky was also Jewish, and so there was this great feeling amongst Jewish people that as Hitler came into power, that the only way to rid ourselves of this disgusting anti-Semitism was through socialism and communism. And so I find it just very interesting trying to just fathom why it is that Zionism occurred and how it came into fruition. And so I kind of started exploring this book today. I mean, as I said, I just literally threw things that I hadn't read this for a year or two, but I found it very. So this is Woodrow Wilson, and this is Paris 1919, and so for many socialists and Marxists, they thought that the First World War was capitalism in crisis, and so this is kind of them trying, the victors, should we say, trying to solve the, work out what the planet's going to look like, or who's going to rule the world and wealth. And so this is Woodrow Wilson, this is Lloyd George, I believe, and this is the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, yeah. And so it seems to me that this is a quite important phase in the Zionist projects, but also in history, just to have a look at this, and also from the Arab point of view, like there was an Arab delegation at this, and so it was the imperial powers basically deciding who would control the Middle East, who would control resources, and so. And as I say, what was interesting was Wilson turned up with a lot of rhetoric about self-determination, and I'd quite like to explore this theme.
Yeah, if you zoom in.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. So the concept of self-determination was and has remained one of the most controversial and opaque. During the peace conference, the head of the American mission of the of the term, no answer ever came. It has never been easy to determine what Wilson meant. Autonomous development, the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, the rights and liberties of small nations, for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determining its own institutions. Did Wilson merely mean, as sometimes appeared, the extensions of democratic self-government? Did he really intend that any people who call themselves a nation should have their own state? Asked the author. And so I've been reading quite a lot about this. I find it very compelling. I don't know if other people do, but the Jewish critique of Israel, and there's a lot of Jewish people nowadays who are getting quite alienated with the Israeli government. And so, but first of all, I'd like to just show. It strikes me, having trying to give a rather poor Marxist analysis of things, when I visited Auschwitz, one thing I found very interesting was what it says on the gates as you walk in. It says, "Work shall set you free." In other words, it was a slave labor camp, and so it strikes me that as we learned last week, that the fascist machine was built up in many ways as a solution to socialism, as a solution to communism, and as we learned last week, it's the concentration camps were initially set up to appropriate the labor power of the gypsies and Slavs and Jewish people, and that just struck me as quite significant, trying to give an economic analysis of where we come from, and so. Newman is a professor at Trent University in the east of Canada, and I want to juxtapose. This is Alan Dershowitz. I'm trying to be sort of as balanced as I can. This is Alan Dershowitz's book, which is called "The Case for Israel," and I can draw your attention to a very. This book caused a lot of controversy. There's a gentleman by the name of Norman Finkelstein, whose books I have read quite avidly. And this is his book, The Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And Norman Finkelstein has taken a stance where he feels that his parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and his parents survived out. His mother survived Auschwitz, and his father survived one of the other camps, I believe. And he's finding it quite. He feels very passionate that the memory of his parents and the memory of his parents suffering, and both his relatives on both sides were massacred in the gas chambers, and he feels there's been an exploitation of this to immunize Israel from criticism. In other words, Israel has tried to appropriate all the discourse surrounding the Holocaust in order to deflect its own violence. And he talks about, when he was growing, deflect criticism of its own violence. Like, he talks about growing up and his mother watching the Vietnam War would get almost hysterical at the violence, and he feels very passionate that the memory of the Jewish suffering against the Nazis should not be used to somehow justify violence against Palestinian people. And so, but I